The White House says the US doesn't believe a genocide is taking place in Gaza. Our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett is following the story and asked National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan why.
More than 35,000 Palestinians have been killed as a result of Israel's war on Gaza. Still, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says the Biden administration does not see the killing of Palestinians by Israel as genocide, even as a UN report presented back in March says there are reasonable grounds to believe that Israel is committing genocide as defined under international law.
How can you say genocide's not being committed?
As I just told you, I think the best way for me to answer that question is actually to ask you to look at the laydown that we gave, which...
Are you saying this isn't happening? Are you saying that she's a liar?
The United States has laid down at the International Court of Justice in writing, in detail, its position on this issue, and I'd ask you to read it.
The National Security Advisor also said there could be a ceasefire in Israel's war on Gaza if Hamas releases the hostages. He's calling on the international community to pressure Hamas to return to the negotiating table and accept a deal. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, the White House.
A US Army officer has resigned from the military in protest of US support for Israel's war on Gaza. The US supports Israel with nearly $4 billion worth of military aid every year. Major Harrison Mann, who was working at the Defense Intelligence Agency, posted an open letter on the social media site LinkedIn that accuses the US of nearly unqualified support for the government of Israel, which has enabled and empowered the killing and starvation of tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians. He continues to state this unconditional support also encourages reckless escalation that risks wider war. Let's go to Patty Culhane, who's following this from Washington, D.C. And Patty, what more can you tell us?
Well, Major Harrison Mann had been with the Army for about 13 years with a specialization in Middle East policy, worked at an embassy. Now he had been working at the Defense Intelligence Agency, focusing on the Middle East. That's a fairly powerful agency within the Pentagon. But now he's released, as you mentioned, this open letter. And he basically said, my work, however administrative or marginal it may seem, has continued to unquestionably continue to that support. He gave a little bit of his history, saying, as a descendant of European Jews, he was raised in a particularly moral environment when it came to bearing responsibility for ethnic cleansing. So really very strong words from the major. And then he said, at some point, whatever the justification, you're either advancing a policy that enables the mass starvation of children or you're not. Now, he resigned November 1st, early from the DIA, and said at the time people asked him, why did you quit early and you don't have a job lined up? And he didn't really go public until now, possibly because of what's happening in Rafah. And he sent this a note to other team members saying, I thought I didn't have any support. Perhaps you're struggling with this as well. And not everyone can quit. I don't expect you to do that, but just know you're not alone. Now, we've reached out to the Army for any sort of comment. We haven't heard back yet. Don't know if he's the first person from the armed forces to quit because of this. We do know that there have been a few resignations within the State Department, a man who worked in the weapons transfer department, a woman who worked with human rights, and another who was the Arabic spokesman for the State Department. And they've all been very public about why they've left. At the same time, we are seeing report after report that within the internal communications, they have a dissent channel at the State Department, lots of cables saying that the U.S. needs to change policy. Same with USAID. But as far as publicly quitting the Pentagon because of this seems to be the first. Now, again, a major is very much a mid-level manager, but it is, again, notable because he's making his dissent public.
Many thanks. Patty Culhane there for us live in Washington, D.C. OK, let's unpack some of the day's developments now with Al Jazeera senior political analyst Marwan Bishara, who's here with me in the studio. I want to focus, Marwan, if we may, on these lines that have been coming out of Washington from the US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. But before we do, I want to flag something that Benjamin Netanyahu said on a podcast earlier on in the day. He said tensions with the US are making it harder for Israel to get the captives out. And now we've had the US coming out affirming its support for Israel and its plans in Gaza.
It's incredulous what's going on between Netanyahu and Biden, Netanyahu and the United States. Of course, Netanyahu is famous for blaming everyone else for his own failure and betraying everyone. Almost everyone in Israel who works with Netanyahu or is no longer working with Netanyahu has already accused Netanyahu of either backstabbing or lying, right? I think Biden is discovering that himself. There's certainly a Netanyahu fatigue at the White House. There's an Israel fatigue in the United States. And in the rest of the world, there's a Netanyahu fatigue and an Israel fatigue. Because of the unraveling genocide on our TV screens, I think people are just getting fed up with more of the same, with not anything changing, right? And using the same excuses. And this is the thing we've heard from Washington as well, of course, as from Israel, because Washington seems to be parroting the lines coming out of Netanyahu and his government about this and that happening in Gaza. But it was really just so nonsensical hearing Jake Sullivan repeating more of the same mantras that already been debunked over the past 7 months about why there are such huge loss of life in Gaza. Clearly, the bombings of hospitals, schools, universities, and so on cannot all be, reduced to, Hamas hides between civilian population.
There's a chorus of nations around the world that believe what's happening in Gaza is very much a genocide. But one of the things that Jake Sullivan said categorically is that right now, Washington doesn't believe it is a genocide at all. It also said it supports Israel in the destruction of Hamas and also believes Israel's operation in Rafah is, quote, targeted. What do words like this indicate at this current time? What sort of message does it send Israel in terms of its ongoing plans and strategy for Gaza?
Impunity. Israel could act with impunity, thanks to the United States. Because somehow the Biden administration, especially Sullivan and Blinken, tend to always find a way to justify what Israel is doing, defend what Israel is doing, or reinterpret what Israel is doing or saying better than the Israelis are doing it themselves. It's really amazing to find these sort of defense lawyers or national security advisor and secretary of state of Israel rather than the United States. But be that as it may, I think the main problem in all of this is that the United States continues to be complicit. And the Biden administration is not able to escape being sort of back into a corner, if you will, in this election year. It's already lost big time in the 5 or 7 swing states. Today's poll published in the New York Times shows that Biden is really losing big time in important states that will really render him the loser of this coming election. But at the same time, the Republicans are even going beyond him, talking about flattening Israel, flattening Palestine, Gaza, even suggesting nuking Gaza, and so on and so forth. The best way for him to have kind of got out of this mess is to insist on a ceasefire. But Netanyahu does not want a ceasefire. The generals in Israel do not want a ceasefire. The security cabinet of fascists and fanatics do not want a ceasefire. So here we are. We find ourselves in the logic of full-blown, eventually, invasion of Rafah, whether the United States likes it or not. But the United States continues to be lost in its own logic.
As always, Marwan, many thanks. Marwan Bishara there.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.